Hidden in the depths of the mind is a secret tomb where knowledge, fear, mystery, and a macabre sense of enjoyment is held. Each corner is resplendent with its own curiosities, and each curiosity appeals to a different soul. You're listening to The Crypt of the Unknown, a podcast that discusses the realms of the horrific and the fantastic in print, games, or on the screen. And now, introducing you to the Guardians of the Crypt, your tour guides. Here are Webb and Stefan JD. Welcome, weary travelers, to the Crypt of the Unknown, where we discuss the horrific and the fantastical in all of its myriad forms. I am Webb, the critical android, and joining me, as he is here for every uncovered discovery we make, it's my friend Stefan JD.
Hello.
How are you, good sir?
I'm feeling pretty good today. How about you?
I am feeling good, quite good, especially because we are going to be talking about a subject that I know I've wanted to discuss with you before on just one of my regular podcasts I host on the Critical Android, and this is definitely something that I know you know an awful lot about. It's something very near and dear to you, and that's the Resident Evil franchise.
Probably the first reason I picked up a book at all to start reading was because I found out that Resident Evil had been made into books after I experienced the games. Kind of hit every note. It's the games, the books. They now have board games. I think they have all sorts of merchandise, drinks, shirts, everything. But it's definitely grown into a phenomenon over time, and I was there at the beginning, which I'm very proud of.
They also have a Resident Evil card deck building game that I've played. I have all the additions to it. So it's a huge franchise, and people probably don't know this because we're early on in the podcast. They might know it if they know you specifically. They would not know that when it comes to Resident Evil, you, sir, go above and beyond in order to capture elements of this game to get those platinum trophies. Have you, if I'm not mistaken, did you platinum trophy all three of the remakes so far for Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3?
Yes, I earned all the platinums for every single Resident Evil except for 0, which I am very close to.
So does that include also 4, 5, and 6?
4 if it had one.
Right.
Right, but basically, yes. And 5, 6, 7, 8 in the future. Just the main series, I should say, but yes.
Now, before we get into today's subject, which is going to be the Resident Evil 3 remake, I have to ask you something, because if any of these bastards is going to be hard to platinum, Resident Evil 1, I mean, there's so many more modes you have to go through on that one. Like, don't you have to complete it with, the true survival one, where the item boxes don't carry contents between them, and then there's, the invisible zombie one, or the explosive zombie one? Did you have to do all those?
Yes. So the survival one wasn't too bad because once you've gone through the game as many times as I have and tried to perfect your routes, then you really don't need the item boxes. The invisible is the same way because you end up knowing where every enemy is, so you can just sit there and shoot it or dodge it if you have to, if you can. One dead zombie force sprayer who follows you around the mansion. He's got bombs strapped to him, and if you touch him in any way, he explodes the whole mansion. That one, thankfully, you don't have to do for the platinum.
Okay, so at least that much. Because when I was looking at all the different game modes, I thought to myself, this is absurd. Who would do this? What crazy, insane individual with too much time on their hands would possibly want to platinum this game? And it turns out I'm talking to that individual right now.
Yes, idle hands are the devil's plaything, so you got to platinum all RE games. My biggest gripe with the first one is that, and this is going to sound funny, but it almost wasn't challenging enough. It made me feel like I had never been more intimate with any other game ever until I platinumed that game, because it was just pure survival horror, and pure survival horror is something I love a lot.
Well, Resident Evil 3 is kind of a far cry from that. When a lot of people talk about Resident Evil 4 as being the precursor to how Resident Evil turned into the action-based franchise that it became with 5 and 6, people point to 4 as being the genesis of that. But I think you could argue, before we talk about the remake, that Resident Evil 3, while it did have survival instincts and all that stuff going on it, actually that started ramping up more of the action-paced gameplay, in my opinion.
I agree. The thing with Nemesis is that they wanted to make something technically that could follow you more through room to room, as opposed to Mr. X, who would show up in set pieces. You could down him, and then that was it till whenever the next time he'd show up. So I think it was more of a technical aspect of upping the fear, and that gave it way to being a little bit more action-y.
They also included more of an opportunity to gain ammunition and some more assault-heavy weaponry. Like you had, I think Resident Evil 3 was the game that introduced assault rifles that had like a percentage base of weapon ammo instead of a full bullet count. It had like a percentage on it.
Correct.
It also introduced the idea of using gunpowder to combine things together and basically equip yourself with ammo of your choosing should you be able to mix them together and find the right ingredients.
Which would make sense in the fact that Jill is a member of STARS, and she should be able to know how to do those things. So it is kind of an interesting little aspect.
I think you mean she's a member of STARS.
Oh, sorry, yeah, STARS. She's also gets better at it over the game. Over the course of the game, you actually do get better at mixing and you get more out of it. So that also makes sense. It's one of those funny things about survival horror, you know, when people compare Resident Evil 2 to Silent Hill and how they control. I mean, obviously, Resident Evil stuck with the tank controls to make you feel it was harder to get away from things. In Silent Hill, people say the combat's atrocious, but in reality, those people that you're playing, they probably wouldn't know how to do anything in combat. So it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. And I will say, I wish there was like a blooper reel that I could have made for Resident Evil 3, because my dream scenario, but you see Jill running down the street, and there's a payphone, and it's ringing. And Jill doesn't know what to do. There's no zombies around, but it's weird that the phone just starts ringing right then and there. So she walks up to it, picks up the phone, and you hear, "You have a collect call from STARS. Do you wish to accept the charges?" And she just hangs up the phone and starts running again.
She's like, Mom, what happened to Wolfie? Wolfie's fine, honey. Wolfie's fine.
No, Stefan.
Oh, sorry. No T2 exploits here. Sorry.
Not quite. Oh, dear. But anyway, what is your experience with... Because before we talk about the remake, again, talking a little bit more about Resident Evil 3, what is your experience with the game? When were you introduced to it? How much did you play it? Did you beat it? All that stuff. What are your thoughts on it?
So this one's a little weird to me because I had started off playing 1 and 2 and obviously fell in love, became a huge fan. 3, however, came out and I wasn't specifically in a position to talk my parents into getting it for me or somehow getting it myself because I was still like 12 or 13 or something. And my parents had gotten a divorce recently and there wasn't a lot of money to go around. Not yet. So I actually went over to a friend's house, and that's where I first experienced it. He was fighting Nemesis on the clock tower, which we will have to get to at some point. I just thought, this looks insane. This looks crazy. And he let me play about 10 minutes of it. He started me off at the beginning. Eventually, I would get it about, I want to say 6 months later. Beat it a couple times and then just kind of moved on. Not because I hated it or anything, but it just felt, at the time, it should have, but it didn't feel as big as and grand as Resident Evil 1 and 2, for whatever reason, in my mind. And so I just moved on, and not even like, I want to say a year or two later or something, we had Code Veronica, so...
And if there's a forgotten gem in the series, it's probably Code Veronica. I never hear that game discussed for the most part.
Yeah, I think it attributes itself to the fact that most people just couldn't get past that plane segment. They wasted all their ammo or whatever they did, but they just got stuck.
Meanwhile, here I am in like most modern Resident Evil games where I'm hoarding all of my ammo to the end, only to realize that it's going to end in some sort of a scripted segment where I could have used the ammo well beforehand because I didn't need it for the scripted. That's the thing that pissed me off about Resident Evil 7, man. I saved all my ammo thinking, I'm going to need this. This is going to be important. The last boss is going to be terrible. Scripted segment.
Yeah, if you play it on... did you play it on Professional by any chance?
I did not go back and play it through in that form.
I should say it's Madhouse,
Madhouse, yeah.
Professional. Yeah, it's a lot harder.
That does not surprise me.
Yeah.
The Mercenaries mode was also originally introduced in Resident Evil 3 as well. Did you play much of that?
I actually didn't. Back in the day, for whatever reason, I just never got into the Mercenaries mode till Resident Evil 4. Still did the Hunk in RE2 and still got all that out of the way. But even then, Hunk to me was just, he was tofu. He was just some box. I I didn't really identify him with in any way, so he's a character that everyone loves that knows nothing about. Yes.
Well, I mean, Hunk is... Don't be so hard on Hunk. Hunk is awesome, man. Gonna be hard on Hunk?
He's got a cool outfit.
Okay, so we'll give Hunk that, and that's it. Great.
Did you happen to do any of the mercenaries?
Well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. I'm going to let you in on a secret. I didn't play much of 3.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't play much of 3. I never beat 3. I've played some of it, but at the time where 3 was available for me to play, because for a while I didn't have a PlayStation. One of my friends did. And he was a big Resident Evil fan. He's a big survival horror guy in general. We played a bunch of games together, fighting our way through them. Did you ever play Galarians?
Yes, I have, actually.
That's when we played. We played Galarians. I know we went through Resident Evil. We went through Silent Hill. That terrified me. Absolutely terrified me. And Resident Evil 2 to me was so scary on the PlayStation that I could not stomach the tension and anxiety that came with playing 3 and knowing that Nemesis was always there. So I never got through all of 3. I got through... I'd say maybe about 30% of it. That was, I just couldn't handle anymore. Just couldn't do it. So my first full experience beating a form of Resident Evil 3 was playing the remake. I think now is a good time to kind of dive into that with one thing further that I guess we could say about Resident Evil 3, the original Nemesis, is that whereas Resident Evil 2 offered 2 different campaigns to play through in 2 different orders, 4 different ways you could play Resident Evil 2. You could do Leon A, Claire B, Claire A, Leon B, and whatever the other combinations are that
I think that's it, but if people are worried about the canon of it, it's Leon B, Claire A.
Right, because you could do Leon A, Claire B, or you could do Claire A, Leon B. So yeah, those are the 4 different playthroughs you could do. But with Resident Evil 3, they didn't do that so much as they had different branching paths that you could go off of, depending on choices that you made at certain points in the game.
Correct. None of them specifically really determined anything until the last one when you're at the bridge. If you decide to jump off of it or push Nemesis off, it varies in if Nikolai dies by Nemesis's hand or you fight him in the communications tower while he's in the Hind D.
Hind D.
Hind D. So that's the only big thing. The other things inconsequential, but still fun. The replay value.
At some point in time, I'm just going to have to do the entire podcast in my one-man production of of Metal Gear Solid.
You know what? Save it till we do something Metal Gear, but I can't wait for people to hear your... you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
I don't want to even spoil it.
Okay, we'll save it. Leave that for later.
Yes. Beautiful.
We're laughing at a joke that nobody else is going to understand right now. They're just like, why are these guys laughing? That's so funny.
It's worth waiting for, trust me.
But with that being said, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Here we have a game that is coming off of the heels of what was considered widely to be one of the best games of the year prior with Resident Evil 2, the remake of Resident Evil 2. But at the same time, a lot of people would consider the original Resident Evil 2 to be the pinnacle of the original series, that original style.
That's true. I think it's always the case you can make for going from like George Romero's Zombies to George Romero's Zombies Die Hard edition, because Resident Evil 2 did up the action and the ante of everything in every way. And I think Resident Evil 3 tried to do the same thing, didn't quite accomplish it for some people. Doesn't mean it's a bad game in any way. In fact, I still consider it one of the greatest in my top 5 of RE games, but it's certainly that one wedged in between 2 and 4, and that other game nobody remembers.
Dead Aim, of course, you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, clearly. Now, it's important before we discuss, fully how this game was received, the climate in which it was entered into. Everybody, for the most part, loved Resident Evil 2. But the real complaint that I've ever heard from somebody who was talking about the game is that they didn't do a good job of making the A and B campaigns line up like they did in the first Resident Evil 2. Where there was a direct link. Like, if you were playing the story, they intersected, they were, locked in place to where something happens here, something happens there, it affects the other playthrough. That is not as prevalent and effective in the remake, where canonically they just don't line up because certain events are happening in one playthrough that should not have happened in the other, but still occur, which kind of breaks the cohesiveness of Resident Evil 2 when you're playing through it multiple times.
Right. Things that Leon do should affect Claire, vice versa, doesn't happen.
Right. So with that being the only major complaint that was filed against Resident Evil 2, here comes Resident Evil 3, and people were all hyped up about this, knowing that one of the big draws of the Resident Evil 2 remake was Mr. X stalking you. And if there's one stalker that's known throughout the Resident Evil pantheon, it's Nemesis. And here we're going to have him in all of his glory in full remake of Resident Evil 3. And that was a huge selling point for this game.
Problem, I guess, with these remakes, and it's not a problem that I really dwell on because I still love them in a different way. But the problem is that when you played with Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake, they kind of, for lack of a better word, blew their wad on what that character could do. So when you bring in Nemesis on Resident Evil 3, you basically have the same thing. There's nothing new there except for maybe he can move faster. He has a rocket launcher. He can speak a little bit.
A little.
And he's taller, which doesn't make sense because he's the better version, the counterpart to Mr. X, because if anyone doesn't know the RE lore, Mr. X is the US created version of that type of BOW, and Nemesis is the European version, as they were competing with one another, something that Umbrella pushed and loved to do, which is why probably all these scientists always off one another at some point.
It's the kind of corporate competition, or kind of like a cabin in the woods with everybody competing to generate kill for the gods.
Right. I always wanted a merman too. It just never happened, you know. The biggest thing about this is that now you have to sort of do the same thing, but you have to make it feel better. And in this case, it succeeds and doesn't exceed because it's, again, doing the same thing, but now he can run, you know, now he can, I don't know, you're more in an open area as opposed to going in certain rooms and being like, all right, well, you can't enter here, I'm good.
Knowing that we were going to hopefully have those things to expect with this remake, I think expectations were a little bit higher than maybe they should have been, because it was also revealed afterwards that Resident Evil 3 was not being made by the same team that made Resident Evil 2. In fact, it was being made by a separate team that was working on it at the same time that 2 was being made, or at least during that development cycle.
It's funny. It's just going back to, I wonder if it was a European company. They're both creating two different tyrants.
Capcom Europe was the one working on this one.
I don't know. It's still a good game. We're going to get into this, but I don't think people should think we're going to go down on this one. There's just some things to acknowledge.
This is a game, and this is kind of fitting, because in the last couple reviews we've done, we've raved over things, we've heavily criticized something, and now here we go where something has a lot of strong points, but it also has some negative points to it. And I want to start off with something very simple. I want to start off with the price point of this game. The biggest controversy over the actual content of the game being the length of it. This game, and mind you, I am not a hardcore Resident Evil player like you are, Stefan. I'm good at the games, but I'm always very methodical because these games make me very anxious. So I take my time, I plan things out, I'm a little overcautious. And I think my run-through for Resident Evil 3 was somewhere around... It was under 7 hours. It may have been 6.5 hours, I think.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Mostly, I would say, generating what I can remember from RE2 and RE3 remakes, I probably had it about the same time. So don't feel bad about that. That's about spot on to what I think everyone goes through.
However, if I have a Resident Evil 4 playthrough, that game could take me upwards of like double that, depending on how thorough then I'm being. If I really want to go after every treasure and I really want to mow down zombies and take my time with things, there's a lot more content to that game. And that's the issue here. I think most people don't realize this at first, but the only reason I realize in hindsight, a lot of Resident Evil games are short. These are short games once you know what you're doing. Right, Steph?
Yeah, I think I beat Remake 1 in an hour and 56 minutes. Remake 2, about the same time. And RE3 Remake, I can beat in an hour and 5 minutes.
There you go. But what separates this game from the others is that whereas in previous games you had different modes you could play through on a replay, you don't have that in Resident Evil 3 Remake.
Yeah, they tried to change something else here, which was interesting and terrifying when I began all this, because I had gotten the platinum in about a week and a half, and it was basically every day just playing it over and over again. One of the things they tried to do is they tried to challenge people who've gone through these games a million times by adding a new difficulty called Inferno mode. That is after hardcore, then there's Nightmare, then there's Inferno. Inferno mode was terrifying for a couple of reasons, because in order to get the platinum, you have to get an S rank, and in order to get an S rank, you can only save your game 3 times. And you have to beat the game in under an hour and a half. So it was scary, but at the same time, I still think Nightmare mode was the one that was worse. Everything in Nightmare mode, so you get used to where enemy placement is, you get used to how many of a specific enemy there is, you can counter them, you can save ammo, etc. In Nightmare Mode, they add more enemies and they move them around, so you never know where they're going to be. There's parts where I would be going through a hallway, and a hunter would suddenly be running towards me around the corner, and that was never there before. It was terrifying.
Now, wait, so if they did that in Nightmare Mode, what did they do for Inferno Mode?
Inferno Mode was basically enemies are just bullet sponges. I mean, you literally can't kill about anything. You have to run from everything. And the Nemesis fight at the end is awful. It's just, you have to be on your A game for a whole 6 minutes or else you're not going to go past it. You have to dodge perfectly.
Well, what about because there's a scene in the hospital with Carlos. What happens when you have to hold the line there if everything's a bullet sponge?
Well, they have grenades and flash grenades. Yeah, you got to stock up.
Okay.
The one point of contention in the story and in Nightmare Mode is that Carlos in this remake is the one who takes out Brad Vickers, which is sad because I feel it should have been done by Jill. On top of that, in Nightmare Mode, Brad doesn't die after you gun him down in front of the RPD. When you're going through the hallways of the RPD, if you pay attention to the windows, he's walking right next to you outside.
That's delightful.
Yeah, and when you make it to the weapons arm room, he's just standing outside the door. So it's terrifying.
So getting into the meat of this game, we'll be able to discuss some of the pros and cons as we start off. So we hop right into here with an interesting little first-person kind of perspective thing. Draws heavily upon what Resident Evil 7 did. And I gotta say, the engine that they've been using for this, the RE engine that they use, this is one hell of a good game engine, graphically especially. This thing is beautiful.
I agree.
I don't even know what I could compare it to. I remember when the Fox engine was used for Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 5, I thought that was great. And then when they did a modified version of that for PT, Playable Trailer, for what would have been Silent Hills, that looked remarkable too, but it's a very short demo thing, so they could afford to splurge on graphics for something that small. But what Capcom has here is something very special that manages to avoid the uncanny valley of looking at characters and thinking there's something not quite right about that, but being detailed, not having a tremendous amount of slowdown, though I will say, this was funny. When I was playing a second run-through where I had unlimited ammo in my pistol, there's a scene where there's a gate up that leads to where the donut shop is. And there's zombies off in the distance. And I was just like, popping shots at them off with the pistol through the gate. And the frame rate on them as they go far off in the distance is just like, it's like four frames a second. You just see them kind of like moving all weird. So obviously the engine was not prepared for me long distance pot-shotting zombies with a 9mm pistol. But it was still, it was adorable. It was cute.
Yes, that is something that does happen, that people do complain about. I think it's okay.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. The same thing happened in Resident Evil 4. If you look at enemies from a long ways away, the graphics are just like, it doesn't know what to do. It's herky-jerky.
Yeah, it's good they built their own engine, though. It's very beautiful.
Yeah, and we get to see that beauty in full display as Jill's going through just having these nightmares, these PTSD kind of flashbacks, which, fair to say, if I went through this shit that she did, I'd be having nightmares too.
Yes, I agree. This opening part, I think, really sets up the character of Jill pretty good, though. We get to see some of her books on the shelves, some of them are about combat, and she's having trouble sleeping. There's some no-dose pills there. It shows that she's kind of doing her detective work on the wall there. She's putting all the pieces together. She's showing how Umbrella ties to who and for what reason. It's got a picture of the stars, so it's kind of a neat little set piece before the action begins there.
Yeah, and the action in this version, this starts right off, going right for it, because Jill gets a phone call, telling her to watch out, and then not 5 seconds later, Nemesis just comes blasting through, which did not happen in the original game.
Yeah, that was, I didn't specifically jump, but I was like, whoa. Did not expect that.
No, and I know some people have complained about that because there's no build-up to him. But I think that kind of works in its favor in the sense of, I don't think Nemesis needs any build-up. I think having that immediate threat right there sets the tone of the game, right then and there.
Well, it's very scary how parallel it is to the real world right now. The first words you hear in this game are, there are people are rioting, and people are dying from a pandemic. There's 100,000 deaths as of now on record. And when I played the game, everyone knows what's going on right now with COVID. Those were the exact same numbers. It was very weird.
Yeah, it was weird on this end too, because it hits home hard. And then Nemesis as being this constant threat. Obviously, if you want to draw parallels to us living in a kind of situation where we have the constant threat of disease looming over us at the moment, it's kind of a scary parallel to make there too. But then in the sense of like using this as a video game trope, we are thrown into the action immediately because we have to flee from Nemesis. And there's a lot of flight elements to this game where you have to run. There's just scenes where you just have to run. And this throws that at us right away so that we know what we're in for when this game starts.
Right. The good part, though, is that Jill's not doing this alone. So after she loses Brad in the bar who gets bit, she kind of runs into this team of soldiers, the UBCS, the Umbrella Biohazard Counter Service. This is probably the greatest part of this story. If anyone has anything to say good about RE3, point to this first and forehand. The good guy has to work with the bad guys.
Yes, but what makes that a bit easier to digest is that one of the bad guys, or quote-unquote bad guys, Carlos, doesn't know that he's actually a bad guy. He does not fully realize how bad Umbrella is. Maybe he's been willfully ignorant of it. Maybe he's just been kept in the dark because it's easier to manipulate somebody that way. But he doesn't realize he's playing for a truly bad team here.
Yeah, he's the unknowing mercenary from another country. I like when he reveals who he is to her, and she always says that line who, again, I forget the lady who does the voice in this game. Sorry, but she says, "Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me?" It's like, yeah, I'd probably have that same response too.
Yeah. And credit to the performances here, because Jill is very well cast and performed here. The actress who I'll have to look up during the course of this, she nails it.
Oh, yeah. Agreed.
Though I also have to give special credit to Carlos's character, too, because he delivers some of the best one-liners in this entire franchise that are legitimately funny and not in a corny way like so many of the others are. Like, if Barry's Jill sandwich line is legendary for what it is, but in a cheesy way. One of my favorites is when Carlos is in the police station, and he's going around looking at things, and he comes across one of the doors, which, what police station in the world is going to have doors that are coded by suits in a card deck and require special keys to open that are tied to those very suits? Like, it's ridiculous. So he goes up to one of the doors, and it's like, he just flat out says, "Hey, here's a weird fucking door."
I mean, they do a weird explanation of it in the lore that the police station was originally an art museum. It kind of makes sense maybe, but it still seems like out of touch with what anyone would do for security in the 90s.
Was in the lore, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the station/museum also designed by the same person who designed the mansion?
I do not believe that's true.
Okay.
I think it was just an older building, an art museum, and the reason why they had the underground and everything was to hide precious art.
All right, well, we'll go with that. I'll run with it.
Yeah, and it apparently didn't have restrooms, which we should note that later on they did fix that.
Yeah, they do make some changes that actually do help with that in terms of making things more believable with the layout of the entire place.
I want to say one more thing about our list of bad guys here, because there's Mikhail and Nikolai, who are the other two big characters, and then the African-American character, I think his name's Tyrone. But Mikhail, the weird thing about him is if you look at his face, and if you know this actor, it's voiced by the guy who played Gorman from Aliens. And it's supposed to kind of look like him, too.
Yeah, that actor, I believe, I want to say it's William Hope.
I think that's his name, yeah.
He does a great job. I especially like his ending line of, "Get off my train."
Oh, yeah, shitbed.
Very Harrison Ford Air Force One there.
Exactly.
But the actress who plays Jill, by the way, is Nicole Tompkins. Provides her voice and does a great job. It is Tyrell, is the unfortunate black guy who has to die because it's a horror movie, or a horror game. But fortunately, his character actually contributes to the progress of the game, so it's not like a wasted character that they just put in there, kill off like every other black guy in every other horror film or game ever.
Yep, except for when Jordan Peele came around, thank God, to change all that.
And, of course, we've got to give a special note to Dawn of the Dead.
And Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead.
In the history of horror, there's been maybe 5 black people who have ever survived a horror film. And one of them is unfortunately not in this game. Not in this game.
One day Capcom will progress.
Well, at least I got to give Capcom credit here in the sense of a lot of Japanese developers can fall victim to playing on a lot of terrible racial stereotypes for black characters, like Barrett in Final Fantasy VII originally. Like, they have him, like, it's almost flat-out jive talking. Like, it's ridiculous how bad that they get that. Like, I know the part of that has to do with the localization, too. There's always been, like, a degree of ignorance to an extent, and maybe that's just a lack of, like, cultural appreciation, because obviously Japan's more of an isolated country. So historically, there's been a lot of terrible depictions of African Americans in Japanese media, but Tyrell here is actually a legitimately interesting character, and how he's not as straight up, like, helpful as Carlos is to Jill, but he understands that, you know, they got to do something here because Umbrella is clearly not quite the good guy. And Tyrell kind of goes along and actually is the one who almost saves the city by trying to make contact with the U.S. government.
Right. Nikolai, on the other hand, has his own agenda going on. So Mikhail, Tyrell, and Carlos are kind of all in the same ballpark of, okay, well, we need Jill's help. She's a member of STARS. You know, they use her abilities to basically get the train going in the subway station and try to get people out of the city, because people really are on that subway and they want to get out, which makes total sense. Nikolai, on the other hand, they don't know this, but he's basically there to watch them combat the BOWs. And in the earlier game, he was doing a whole smattering of other things. He was trying to get Tyrant's blood from the special Tyrant, and somehow he was like in every set piece everywhere in every Resident Evil game doing something at some point. The guy had like a watch on and he knew where to be. But in this game, he is setting them up, the UBCS, to get slaughtered, basically, just to see how they stand up against the BOWs.
Yeah, at least they make his part in things a lot more believable. And I think that's one thing that this game does well in terms of the story, is that I think it tells a more cohesive, put-together story that makes a bit more logical sense in this world than the original does, in my opinion, at least.
No, I agree. Going back to what you were saying, though, about Japan being a little isolated, Nikolai does stick with the 90s trope of, oh, your voice is European? Well, you're obviously the bad guy.
Yeah, it's guilty of that.
Yeah. But it does still make what he's doing more believable. And again, this was all by the admission that from Europe, Nemesis, he wants to record that battle data for the European Umbrella website or site, so it makes sense.
Yeah, and then for the way the story progresses here, it's mostly, you know, for the large part, we're following Jill as she's just trying to do a little bit of what she can, bit by bit, to try to first power the subway train to make sure it can get going, because they need to get those people to safety, and they think this is the best way to do it. We get the train going, go up there, help us out, do that, and we can get these people out of here. So Jill's trying to do that, and the opening kind of set piece here, or I guess a setting, this is, to me, the best part of the game. I enjoyed going around the streets of Raccoon City, being able to break into certain buildings and raid them for supplies. It gave me this sense of exploration and reward for going around, finding what buildings I could go into, breaking the locks with either the bolt cutters or the lockpick, and really exploring to earn these things that I would find. I love that sensation.
Yeah, it finally gives us a sense of the city from the first one, but it does it in a more strategic way. I mean, you would obviously have no reason to go to some of those alleys unless you saw, oh, there's a drugstore there, I could go get some first aid spray, you know, whatever it is you need, some herbs. There's definitely more of a reason to explore. In the original game, there was just the set piece of the city, unless it was something scripted, like Nemesis following you into the restaurant and having to blow his ass up.
Well, Nemesis does follow us quite a bit during this sequence, no doubt about that. And you get to see how much of a threat he is very quickly here, because he does not hold back if you get close to him.
Yeah, that's true.
He is a couple of punches away from just being able to lay you out on the ground and finish you off. He's got a mean overhand right.
You know, the thing with Nemesis in this game, again, goes to the fact that they wanted to make him, you know, bigger and more scary. But the truth is that something bigger would move slower. So they should have made him slightly smaller than Mr. X, maybe, but I guess that wouldn't have seemed imposing, which is kind of the problem again with how this game is. But you do get, relatively other enemies like the brain demos when you go to the power station to power it up. I don't know, did that part scare you at all? Because the first time it did, and I still appreciate it for that, but not so much anymore.
100%. Yeah, that part freaked me the hell out. At first, I didn't know if, like when Jill gets impregnated with, I guess, the spawn of this thing, I thought it was just going to be something of, okay, it's a scripted event, there's going to be something here that will cure you. So I just tried trudging through thinking, okay, I'm going to find an antidote. I didn't know you had to just use one of the herbs you got that would do it. And I remember just taking my time going through there, realizing, oh my god, they're everywhere, they're everywhere, they're everywhere. And I keep trying to kill them until I realize partway through, shit, they're just regenerating from the walls. It doesn't matter how many of them I kill, they're coming back. I've used up so much ammo. So I had to restart, try it again. And there I was just, like, running through, just, like, being like, fuck the entire time. I hate that section. It messes with me, man.
I think that's fair. I think after going through it so many times now, there's a good specific path, and you can also save a lot of ammunition by following that path. So I think I shoot my shotgun maybe 2 or 3 times through that whole section.
Easily the part that I hated the most in terms of, like, an area to go through, it had the most tension for me. When it was done and over with, and I was able to burn the son of a bitch down with the electrical lines, I was happy as shit. Glad I never had to go back there again.
And Jill saying, enjoy that. It's like, yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, officer.
You didn't have to tell me twice.
Yeah, she's got some good quips in this one.
And then it doesn't take too long after that, once you've restarted everything, to where you start walking back through, and then out from the wall, just like busts out stars.
Yeah.
Which, that did make me jump a little bit when that first happened.
It did. I had seen the demo, so I saw it coming, but it still made me jump as well.
Oftentimes in the game, if you can take down Nemesis at certain spots by injuring him a bit, he will drop. Somehow he's carrying these massive weapons crates on him. Don't know how, whatever. He'll drop these umbrella weapons crates that you can use to either get upgrades for your gun. Sometimes there's ammunition. So there is a bit of a risk-reward in terms of trying to take down Nemesis a little bit so you can pick up those items.
Correct. My advice is always just to bring a grenade. If you don't have a grenade, bring a flash grenade and shoot his heart. That's what I would do.
It almost always works. And then you can, grab a quick upgrade, some of which are pretty helpful, especially the burst fire at times. That was really helpful.
Oh, God, yeah.
But if you can grab those and get moving, then, at least Nemesis is down for a little bit, so you can gain some ground on him and keep moving. But this does bring up something that's a little frustrating to me. This game is very reliant on being able to use the emergency dodge mechanic.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sorry, but I could never get a full grasp on the window of time to use that in. There were times where I thought I had it, and then times where I clearly did not. It was a very frustrating window of time to use that in.
I think I felt that way in the beginning. Obviously, after beating Inferno, you kind of have to. You got to know that or you're not going to beat it. But yeah, I think at first, and sometimes even still, like I played it yesterday and today just for this, and I missed a couple times. It's still, you have to be kind of spot on. It is hard.
I also find that, and I don't know why this is the case, but the zombies in here recover and sometimes move a lot faster than I feel like they should. For example, you could shoot a zombie, get him onto the ground, stab him a couple times, and he'll start to get up, and they will just lunge insanely fast.
This is true. Another big thing that they took away, because you're not wrong on that, is Capcom was seeing the speed runs of Resident Evil 2 Remake, and they noticed that people were shooting the zombies in the leg, which is still traditional for getting by zombies. Just shoot them till they flinch, and the moment they flinch from shooting them in the kneecaps, you just run by peacefully. In Resident Evil 3 Remake, you cannot do that. It takes at least, I don't know, about as much as ammunition to take them down as it does to make them flinch. So you can kind of still do it, but it's not like 1 or 2 shots. It's more like 4 or 5.
Yeah, and Jill's use of the knife, which is generally something I use in every other Resident Evil game to make sure something's fucking dead. Jill's idea of using the knife is just like poke at something. Like with a very limited range, just pokes.
Mm-hmm. She's definitely a stabber, not a slasher.
Yeah, Carlos, on the other hand, just fucking splashes that thing across. But Jill's just like poke, poke. That makes the knife less helpful. I think they depowered the knife a little too much, in my opinion.
I can't remember. Didn't use it too often in 2, except for hardcore mode, which I only played once. I can't remember.
Well, even compared to other games, I think this knife is a bit too depowered, in my humble opinion.
Mm-hmm. You're probably right.
The Nemesis fights, something we'll get to here, because there's different stages of Nemesis fights where you can do. The ones where he's in his humanoid form are pretty epic. The flamethrower one is a lot of fun.
I agree. One of the things that people will notice, too, in this and in Mr. X is that they become more violent the more damage they take.
Yes.
And the reason for that is because what they're wearing is called an eliminator suit, and it's supposed to stop them from changing into the hideous BOWs they later become. And Umbrella has more control over them through the Parasite Nemesis or the chip in Mr. X, the more their eliminator suits are intact.
And as we continue to make a dent in these guys, so they continue to become more powerful and transform, and we see that where Nemesis turns into kind of like a dog-like creature, I guess you could say, or at least a four-legged monstrosity. And that becomes the genesis of 2 of the other fights with him. One outside of, basically in like a central square of the town, and another that happens in closer to the end of the game, where you're actually in like the underground laboratory warehouse thing, where there's a bunch of tanks set up and all that. And those 2 fights, this is where I start to have some qualms with the game, good sir. I feel like these fights don't fit in very well with the Resident Evil like feel of the game. Like, I don't know, a lot of these creatures in RE games tend to be very slow, methodical for the most part. You have to be very deliberate with your actions. You have to know when to strike, wait for the opportunity, seize it, but they tend to be kind of a slow pace, more of like a Dark Souls kind of a combat. As for these fights, though, Nemesis is going so fast, and it almost feels kind of ridiculous how he keeps circling the arena the way that he does in these fights. Mm-hmm. It almost feels, I don't know, like it's from a completely different game that's just tacked on here. The circling the arena thing, it kind of just got corny after a while to me.
It's definitely a set piece, and instead of making people to use the dodge ability, which they should have just done anyway, because they should have made it easier to deal with, but he just ends up running around and becoming a set piece. One of the moments in the game that really hurts the most, because when you get to that city, what you're actually in is the courtyard to the cathedral that was cut content from this game. They cut that whole part out, and they just made you fight Nemesis in the little courtyard, and that was it. Funny enough, there is one little cool factoid there. If you look at the highway sign right there, it does say highway 114. I'm curious if I'll get that right, but it says 2 Arklay Mountains. Yeah, Arklay Mountains is where the Spencer Mansion was, where this whole story took place. So.
Clever girl. I think I could have dealt with that one fight with Nemesis there in his animal-like form if it didn't have to be repeated again later on, a second time, just they changed the setting and they threw zombies on the ground.
Right, the dead factory. I agree with you there. That's a big problem. That and the cut content, definitely.
Yeah, they should have recycled, either kept Nemesis in his human form a little bit longer, or humanoid form a little bit longer to make that fight something different, and then save the animal form for later, or mix something up to where it wasn't just same song, different verse the second time, because that was absurd having to do it again just with the idea of okay, well, we'll do the same thing, except now we'll have zombies.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
No, I should say, to me, that was more annoying than anything. Putting zombies down on the ground that you had to watch out for at the same time you're trying to attack Nemesis, that's not fun to me. That's annoying. Make the boss do something special himself instead of just throwing in 2 zombies on the ground that keep popping up in between, him taking damage. Change it up, because it's ridiculous doing it another way to me.
I agree. Even the little cutscene that happens afterwards doesn't particularly make sense to me, because, as we know, Nemesis tries to reach in through a gate that Jill has shot down and cut off his arm, and he hits her with this little piece of him that infects her, and she passes out for a day. And guess what? Nemesis also passes out for a day. It's really weird, because they're both just laying there, and Carlos comes along and takes her to the hospital, of course, but it's just a weird little thing. Instead of giving us the church, they give us that run-around dogfight, and then they both just lay there for a day. I don't think Nemesis would have done that. He probably would have got back up, right?
Well, you would think. I mean, that's one of the things that doesn't make sense about this game, is that kind of ridiculous notion there of how conveniently they're both down for a while. And that after Carlos picks her up is where we get the second area with Carlos, because before that we get him at the police station. And I think that's another place where this game could have expanded to give us more content. They could have done a little bit more with the visit to the police station.
I agree. Some of the questions that fans had, like, oh, how'd that wall happen in the shower of the RPD? And they always wanted it to believe that it was Nemesis. It turns out it was just Carlos blowing up a bomb.
Yeah, Carlos.
Yeah. Good old Carlos.
Oh, Carlos. I do like the hospital section for the most part. There's a lot of tension that can happen there. I don't know how I feel about having to explore it as both Carlos and Jill. That feels like it's kind of like cutting down on assets. Like, we spend more time in the hospital, but why didn't you just, like, add in the cathedral, the clock tower?
Right. Usually when I play that segment, I don't even bother with the, I think it's the Magnum you can get in the hospital. I just pick my way out of there and go to the underground facility, as opposed to treading through the hospital second time. Too many hunters for me.
That was the scary part. There were quite a few hunters. That was probably the most exciting part of the game to me, is when you have to come across the Hunter Omegas, like the good ones, as opposed to the weird ones that just eat you.
Oh, the Gamma Hunters in the sewer, yeah.
Yeah, the Gamma ones they're just like fat blobs that take way too many bullets to get down, and then they just eat you and kill you in one shot.
To be fair, they do look like a pimple that needs to be popped with your shotgun, but that's
Yes.
true. I do hate them. I hate them so much.
They are a frustrating lot. They didn't terrify me the way that the other hunters did. Like I said, the good ones, the ones that they should have made more of, those ones are really terrifying because they also can one-hit kill you, kind of cheaply, I will say.
Yep.
But their presence makes itself known as, like, these guys are a threat. So when they're around, things get real, shit gets hairy fast. And that did add a palpable sense of tension to the game, which was different than just dealing with zombies and the other ones.
Trying to think. The ominous part about this, again, is if you had all these ideas of Jill and Carlos working together now, as opposed to this actually being Jill's story, which it originally was, still kind of is. If you had all these ideas and you knew what you were going to do with it, then just don't cut the content. Another thing they did for speaking again of the Gamma Hunters, is they pretty much replaced the worm battle, the giant worm you fight, I forget its name, from the original Resident Evil 3, and they just put Gamma Hunters. So it's kind of give or take. If you like those, maybe that was an acceptable replacement. For me, it wasn't. I would have liked to see the giant worm because I hate it and I want to kill it.
And this is where we get into a problem with how to properly criticize a game like this and how to properly critique it. Because I think you have to look at this from two different perspectives. What does it do right and wrong as a remake? And what does it do right and wrong as a standalone game? I think it's safe to say that as a standalone game, this works better and is a more tighter constructed and palpable action experience than if you look at this from the perspective of being a remake. Because I think if you try to compare this to a remake to Resident Evil 3, I don't think a number of decisions were made that should have been made. I think they cut out way too much. I think they added some very good story elements which were helpful. What they subtracted brings this game down a bit too much as a remake, and it's frustrating in that sense. Mm-hmm. But as a standalone game, this is pretty solid wall-to-wall action from start to finish for as long as it lasts, which, honestly, is not as long as it should last.
Right. Things that they did add, too, because people have always loved the cameo by Kendo in Resident Evil 2, and he is the guy who created the STARS Samurai Edge guns. So when Jill runs into Kendo in this game, that's great. We finally get to see those two characters interact, but it's also frustrating because they really don't interact enough. They just run into each other, hi, bye, see you later. So even the things they do add can also add a little bit of frustration as well.
Here's the thing that really irks me, I guess, the most. This game should not be a full $60 game based on what is offered. What they did to kind of compensate for the lack of things is they tacked on the multiplayer Resident Evil Resistance. Here's where I have an issue with that. If you want to make that a separate game that you could download if you already bought Resident Evil 3, and you could buy it as like a $20 upgrade, fine. That means the base game is $40. I think that is a much more acceptable price for this game. I would be happy paying $40 for this content, even though it's still a bit lacking because, it's a discounted price. But to charge $60 for it, and knowing that there's a multiplayer component that I'm really probably never going to play, that irks me. I do not like that they stripped out so much, even stripped out the mercenaries mode, and then tacked on this multiplayer that I know a lot of work went into. I know that Capcom really wants it to succeed. They want to give people an experience, all that stuff. I know why they did it, but it should not have come at the expense of actual content for the game, and it could have been easily sold as its individual multiplayer component, could have sold it online, and that would have made for a better experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's one of the problems, too, is that the way they hyped it up, the way it looked like it was going to play, it could have possibly been some sort of Resident Evil Outbreak game, but you had somebody controlling the BOWs, which would have been fine, but it wasn't that. It was even a downgrade, I would say, from something that's very much like it, like Left 4 Dead, or any of the other horror games that have come out, like Dead by Daylight, Friday the 13th, the game. It just doesn't work for me, and I even I played it a lot when it came out, and then I re-downloaded it and played it after I destroyed it, and then I had to destroy it again because I just couldn't get into it. But, I agree with you. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that would be a fair trade. $40 and $20 for Resistance.
It could have easily been that way. And see, this is the thing that also really frustrates me, is that what's there for Resident Evil 3 is quite good. And if they just did some free DLC to expand the campaign, add back in Mercenaries mode, add the Cathedral back in, make it so that you can do the Mercenary mode and play as other characters. And then I think if you do that as free DLC, you have a more complete package, at least something. Like, this game just needs Mercenaries mode and maybe another hour of content. Just put another hour of content in there, and I think you've got more fair experience. Because I will say that, again, this game is so tightly constructed that with the way that they've built it all together, it does make you want to play through it again, especially with the upgrades you can buy at the end of the game. Because I do want to play through this game now that I have an unlimited pistol, and I just want to be able to put the knife away for good and then realize, I could stab it, see if it's dead, or I could just pow, 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 pow. Now you're dead, aren't you?
Just save up for that rocket launcher, Webb. Just do it.
I don't want to save up for the rocket launcher.
So much fun.
But it's just those little things that could be done that could have turned this game into a good game, into a great game. The streets of Raccoon City, great. I love that part. Carlos in the police station, also strong. Cut a little bit too many corners there, I think. But still a fun revisit, but could have done more there. Sewers that Jill goes through. Sewer scenes and sewer areas of games begin to bore me and frustrate me because they're so overused, I feel.
I think that was a big point of contention for even the Resident Evil 2 remake. People said they hated the sewers.
It's done so much overdone so much that it really needs to just be eliminated from video games at this point in time. Stop using sewer sections. And I think elements of the lab part go on way too long, too.
Here's my problem with the lab. These were made by separate teams. I didn't even look if the designer was the same or anything like that, but the labs do not feel like the same type of labs, or were constructed by the same company, I should say. So I don't know if they did that on purpose, but I just like the look of the lab in RE2 Remake as opposed to RE3. I
had more of a problem with that. There's that one area where you have to go gather all the fuses.
Yeah.
And that just felt like, basically it's a cargo area and you have to lift up all the lifts, you have to go through. It just got tedious. I can respect puzzle sequences. I have a bit less respect for mazes. I hate these cluttered messes of mazes. And just like how one of the parts I hate most about Resident Evil 4 is the goddamn hedge maze. I hate mazes. I feel that they're aggravating. I like things more where it's an open-ended area, where the exploration feels more organic, where it's like, okay, I can choose to take a left, I can choose to take a right. I'm not forced to go through this zigzagging path that it just feels so unrealistically constructed. Like, who has this laid out like this? Who organized this room?
Spencer Mansion didn't feel as zigzaggy.
No. Like, it felt more organic, but these mazes always feel very forced. I don't like being forced through a game, goddammit. Like, I've been playing through God of War lately. My first time playing through God of War for the PS4.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a linear path to follow, but that path branches out into different places where you can take some time to explore. It doesn't feel like a maze. It feels nice. And you get rewards for exploring. And it also feels nice. Just like in the first part of Resident Evil 3 when you're on the Raccoon City streets. So some of those sections could have been done better. The hospital is very tense. Blob Nemesis, the final form, the Blob, That's a bit much. That's a bit over the top.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they were going for there because in the original Resident Evil 3, when you're at the Dead Factory, you throw Nemesis down into the little pool or whatever. He absorbs a dead tyrant that's already in there. He absorbs the rest of the flesh-eating ghouls that are already in there. In this one, I don't know how he gets that big. I guess he absorbed those other bodies, but wouldn't they have disintegrated in the acid bath? I don't get it.
Once again, we get something that I'm kind of a little tired of with Resident Evil games. The quote-unquote, like the puzzle boss, I guess you will, where this final fight with him is easier than the fight beforehand. Because all it is using the railgun. You can take some pot shots, little pods that pop up on him, and then you go to the railgun and just fire these huge blasts at him. But I guess the thing that puzzles me the most about it is, as much as I love blowing a giant flaming hole through Nemesis, it's a thing of beauty. How is that more lethal to him than being disintegrated by acid?
That's a good question. I don't know if acid isn't as strong as electricity or a laser, I guess. So maybe fire. Does acid burn as much as fire? A cinder, like a metal factory, like a T1000 burning? I don't know. That's a good question.
I do respect the scope of the battle, but I think this is an issue that sometimes pops up too much with video games. It's the idea that a bigger boss is a scarier boss, or a bigger boss is a better boss. And no, that's not the way. Sometimes you can just have a one-on-one conflict. I would much rather finish that fight with Jill fighting off Nemesis in its tyrant form, just going toe-to-toe with him, rather than that battle against Blob Nemesis.
Right, which they do in the original. So, take of that what you will.
And I did like when I played the Resident Evil 2 playthrough, you saw me finish the game. I had saved a good chunk of ammunition for that final fight against Mr. X, and it felt good and rewarding.
That is definitely the better fight. They just used Mr. X too much in RE2 Remake, which was a good thing at the time, but then when you have to do it with Nemesis again, obviously, like you said, you'd rather fight him in the Tyrant form, 1-to-1, mano-a-mano, but they already did that in RE2 Remake, so I think that was the thing. They just said, well, we gotta up the ante, and clearly bigger means better, but in this case, it certainly didn't. I will give it credit in Inferno mode that it was tough as nails. That was a really tough fight. You literally have to dodge at least every 5 seconds.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, and if you get hit once, he has combos where he can hit you 3 times in a row, you're dead. So it's hard.
Yeah, that reminds me, by the way, that penultimate fight before that, when he can, stun lock you with the tentacles, that pisses me off. Stun locking, one of the worst things to me that I feel about video games, especially when it comes to, non-fighting games, because in fighting games, obviously, stun locking is a huge part of it. But with a game like this, stun lock, whether it's you against an enemy or an enemy against you, it cheapens the difficulty and it cheapens the victory. I don't want to be able to stun lock an opponent to death to kill them. And I don't want an opponent stun locking me to death because it feels cheap and removes you from the game. Just fuck you. Doesn't matter how well you try to do it this part. You're stun locked, you're done. You can't recover from this. It's over. It is cheap and it pisses me off.
That's not how you want to have a game, especially a horror game. You want to at least give them some chance of survival some way.
Yeah.
One of the problems with Nemesis 2 is that he's hunting you so often, trying to stun lock you, that in this game he doesn't even kill one STARS member. That's his whole mission. He doesn't kill
true.
one.
Yeah.
And in the first one, he at least gets Brad Vickers. Was he really the threat we all believed him to be? I don't know.
No, the true threat was our fear of him.
Yeah, the adventure was obviously about the friends we made along the way. So
there's plenty of fish in the sea.
Yeah, but we don't want to be left in a Carlos-less world, so.
No. It's all about the journey.
It's all about the love interest.
Yeah. A stitch in time saves 9. A bird in the band is worth Roger McGinn in a Tom Petty crossover.
There you go. One king should only wear crimson, or else you get Prague. I have no idea.
So you got proggers.
You get proggers.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, and one other thing I gotta say. They took out a lot of the puzzles that were in Resident Evil 3, the original. And I like the puzzle elements of the RE games. I wish there was a little bit more of those in there. Ultimately, I will say that from start to finish, at least the game is incredibly well paced. It is probably one of the better paced games ever
ever really played.
I'll agree. It's a nonstop journey. There's no slowdown. When there is, there's high tension for the next thing. So it really is the, as Jill would put it, your last escape. And you really are trying to escape.
Yeah, so for what it does well, I'm glad. I mean, I think Resident Evil 4, one of its biggest problems is its pacing and probably a bit too much content in it at times. Like, I could do with about 50% less of the goddamn castle, because you spend so much time in that fucking castle. And it at some point in time, it becomes a slog. I never felt that way playing Resident Evil 3, and I will give it a lot of credit for that, for being one of the better paced action, survival horror, however you want to put it. Very, very well paced in that sense. And if there was a bit more to it, I'd give it probably an 8 out of 10. But as it is, it's to me more of like maybe a 6, which is good. A 6 out of 10 is still a good score. So when you get below 5, that's when things are not great. So, I don't know, at least in my opinion, that's where it kind of falls for me. I don't like numbered ratings, but just to give like a perspective on things, that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Right now, I think the game is like $30 or less, so it's definitely worth picking up. For me, being an I hardly ever call myself this, so take it with a grain of salt, but an RE fanboy, quote unquote, I thought this game was everything I wanted from it, excluding the cut content, excluding Nemesis just being something that I didn't specifically like. He's still a threat. He's still awesome. I still had fun, but I don't know if I'd go for 6 out of 10. It'd probably be like an 8, but only because, again, I like what they're doing with the remakes. They don't have to be the original games. I accept that. But as we've said before, there was cut content, and the game did feel short. It should have had a price drop. I paid the full $60. That's where my head's at on this one. It's still a good game.
Yeah, and I'm looking at it purely from the perspective of the game as itself. If I were judging this as a remake, I'd probably give it like a 4, knowing from what I did from the original versus this. If you're like, what did you do? What were you thinking? This is not... What are you doing? But we do want to hear your feedback on the game. Before we wrap things up, finally, any final thoughts on the game, Stefan?
Just if you are casually an RE fan, right now the price point is worth it. Otherwise, I don't know what else I could say to convince you. It's a good game. I think so. And it's not too long. It won't eat too much of your time. So give it a shot.
Actually, here's a good question to kind of wrap things up. If somebody came up to you and said, I really want to experience Resident Evil 3 and what that game is like, would you tell them to play the remake or the original?
That is a good question. I would say play the original.
Wow, the original over the remake. That is, I would mostly agree with you, but I would ask a person this. I would ask them, have you played any of the traditional Resident Evil games, or including the remake of 1? Because if you enjoy that style, then you should definitely play the original Resident Evil 3. But if you can't stomach that, then play the remake, and then visit the original afterwards to see how it's different, how it's better in many ways.
I think that would make sense. Yeah, I'd just be a jerk and be like, no, just forget that. Go play the original. But that's true. A lot of people have a problem with old school RE and tank controls, so I feel that for you guys. I don't have that problem, but I feel it.
I don't have that problem either, but then again, you and I grew up playing these games, so we're kind of I guess rooted in that tradition of knowing how it works. Kind of like with like Mega Man, for example. If you know how to play a Mega Man game and the run and gun style there, then a lot of other platformers are not going to be as much trouble for you as if you didn't play those games.
Yep, that's true. Mega Man does teach you and condition you in that way.
Which is, it's funny we mentioned that, because there may very well be a Crypt of the Unknown podcast episode coming up about that subject of Mega Man.
I can't wait.
I can't either. So at least for this episode, though, we do want to hear your thoughts on Resident Evil 3. Let us know what you think in the comment section. We obviously have said a lot of good things and bad things about the game, and, that leaves something open to discussion. That's one of the good things about something that has the positives and negatives, because it can lead to stimulating conversation. So let us know in the comments. And then, Stefan, I want to thank you for being here for another great episode.
Thank you guys for being here with us.
And if you have any other questions or concerns about the show and the direction that it's going to go in, then please leave also suggestions for what you'd like to see covered. We do want to be able to tackle a bunch of different things that not only we enjoy, but also you might enjoy too. But until then, thank you once again for listening. There are more unknown mysteries to uncover. But for now, the crypt is closed.
Bye.